Rameses. Jara ran down the dark, narrow street. Her breath was coming in short, painful gasps, and her legs felt like they were made of putty. Tired as she was, she could not let the Egyptian soldiers get her. The fear of being beaten, or worse, pushed her onwards. Staggering into an alleyway surrounded by stone houses, Jara tried to quiet her breathing. She easily slid into a tiny hiding place behind a barrel. Jara drew in a sharp breath as she heard the pounding of soldiers' feet and their angry voices. "Where is she?" "She couldn't have gotten away. The little tramp." A guard was barking orders. "You three, head down the street. The rest of you spread out and search the side roads. We'll catch that little thief." A shadow darkened the entrance to the side street in which Jara was hiding. She bit her lip. Her whole body was trembling. Walking through the alley, the Egyptian guard peered about sharply. Jara pulled her legs up to her chest and tried to shield herself with her basket. She held her breath until her lungs ached, praying that the soldier wouldn't find her. After looking around, the man shrugged and began to walk away. Relief swept over Jara, but it came too soon. As the guard walked past her, the sword which hung by his side struck the barrel. The barrel was empty and toppled over. Impulsively, Jara reached out to grab it. The soldier saw her. An exclamation of surprise came from his lips. He jerked the barrel away. "I've found her," the soldier bellowed. "Please, sir," Jara began, but was interrupted when the soldier caught a handful of her hair. He yanked Jara to her feet. Jara screamed and struggled, but was dragged out to the main street. She was thrown down before a broad, sneering Egyptian who held a long whip. More soldiers seemed to pour out of the shadows and surround her. "What are you doing here after curfew, girl?" the man with the whip demanded. "Please, please, sir," Jara pleaded as tears of pain gathered in her eyes and obscured her vision. Before she could say more, she felt the whip hit her back with tremendous force. Jara barely kept herself from falling on her face. "What were you doing here?" the man shouted. "I was bringing linen to the queen," Jara exclaimed. "My mother, Mariel, is in charge of making linen for the queen." "A likely story," the Egyptian snorted. "No, I'm telling the truth. Ask the queen," Jara practically screamed. No one listened to her plea. The whip struck her back again and again. The soldiers around Jara laughed and mocked her pain. Jara bit her lip so hard that she tasted blood. Soon she could hold back the screams no longer. Her shrill cry pierced the still air. She began to feel lightheaded, and then the blows stopped. Someone was shaking her. "No, please, leave me alone," Jara begged weakly. "Jara, Jara." "Huh? What?" Jara sat up, panting and wet with sweat. Her mother's eyes were staring into hers. "It's morning. The 4 men will be here any minute. You've overslept. Get some breakfast," Mother ordered angrily. "Yes, Mother," Jara replied. Her heart was racing, but relief washed over her like a wave. "It was only a nightmare," she told herself, releasing a shaky breath. "Only a nightmare." Jara dashed down the street, clutching a basket filled with linen. Turning a corner in the dusty road, she saw a group of Israelite men pulling a wagon full of bricks. They were straining hard at the ropes, their muscles tight and flexing. An older man's legs suddenly gave out and he collapsed. "Up, up, you fool," the overseer commanded, but the man couldn't rise. "Up, I said," the overseer yelled. He pulled a whip from his belt and began to beat the man. Jara gasped. The man cried out, begging for mercy, but the fierce whine of the whip and the terrified screams didn't stop. Jara wanted to cover her ears. She pressed herself up against a stone building, trying to edge around the overseer and avoid his whip. Finally, she passed the horrible scene and ran into the city of Rameses. The streets were growing dark. "Oh no," Jara panicked. "It's getting late. I'm late in delivering the cloth again. What'll they do to Mother?" Jara forced herself to run as fast as her sore legs would carry her. She had to get to the palace fast before their family was punished. Tears of worry and weariness threatened to spill out of Jara's eyes. She blinked them back. "I hate being a slave. I've been a slave for 12 years. I want to be free. I want my family to be free without any Egyptians around threatening to beat us or punish us. It just isn't fair," she thought angrily. Her father said that the Israelites have been slaves to the Egyptians for over 400 years, and the Egyptians just kept getting crueler. "Why can't they treat us like normal people?" Jara struggled up one of the steeply sloped streets. She looked up briefly to gauge where the sun was in the sky. The sun was just beginning to sink behind the capital city. Turning around, Jara saw the land of Goshen behind her falling into shadow. "If I hurry, maybe everything will be fine. Maybe Ada will be waiting for me and can smooth things over." Jara thought as she started to run again. Jara kept in the shadows of the tall buildings, eyes always alert. She didn't want to be caught by any Egyptian guards. Usually her brothers came with her and there was nothing to worry about. But tonight, Aitan and Lemuel had been kept late at work and Jara had been made to go to the city alone. Suddenly, around a bend in the road, some Egyptian soldiers appeared, well armed and coming towards her. Jara looked frantically for a place to hide. There was a side street and she dashed into it, panting and wheezing. She saw a wooden barrel and slumped down behind it. A sudden thought struck Jara. She gulped hard. This is exactly what happened in my nightmare. Please, oh please don't let it come true. Jara curled her feet and legs underneath her. I hope they didn't see me. The frayed edge of her dress brushed the dirty road as she pulled the basket closer to her, trying to make herself as small as possible. The men's voices came closer. Jara's heart was thumping in her ears so loudly that Jara thought the soldiers would hear it and find her. Briefly their figures appeared, shooting ominous silhouettes down the alleyway. Jara held her breath to keep from screaming. To her utter astonishment, the soldiers continued on their way, not even looking in her direction. Slowly Jara exhaled in great relief, stood up, and then crept out of hiding and continued down the main street. Dusk was quickly approaching and the sunset painted the sand dunes on the distant horizon in a rainbow of colors while Jara struggled up the slight hill on which the palace rested. She hurried around a corner of the outer wall and came to the servants' entrance. 2 guards stood outside of it. Nausea welled up in Jara's stomach as she approached the guards, but the guards barely noticed her and let her enter with a grunt of welcome. They knew what errand she was on. Jara tried to still her heavy breathing and pushed the heavy door open. She slipped in and the gate closed behind her with a resounding bang. Inside the protective palace walls, Jara jogged through a small but lavish courtyard. Water trickled from numerous fountains, flowers perfumed the air. Rich and colorful couches and cushions littered the ground. Jara ran through the garden and came to the wooden door which led into the kitchen. But then she stopped in her tracks. Ada wasn't there. Where is she? Did she forget to come get the linen? She doesn't usually forget. Jara was left with no other choice but to knock on the door. She timidly lifted her hand and knocked. For several sickening minutes, nothing happened. Abruptly, the door was pulled open and Jara was thrilled to see Ada step out into the pale evening light. Jara? What are you doing here alone? Ada asked in surprise. Her friend's slim, graceful figure was covered in a white linen dress which glowed in the fading sunlight. Her rich brown curls framed her beautiful, loving face. But though Ada had a smile on her lips, her dark eyes seemed fearful and uneasy. I had to come alone. Everyone else was working, Jara replied. But here's the cloth. I'm sorry I'm late. Ada took the cloth from the basket, her gold bracelets tinkling as she said, It's quite all right. I'll keep your family from trouble. I wish I could have someone escort you back to your house since it's getting dark, but there's trouble in the court. We have some visitors here to see the pharaoh, and though I would love to stay and talk, I'm afraid I must get back to the queen. She's been fretting all day, and I'm the only maid she will turn to for comfort. Do you have a message for your family that you would want me to bring back? Jara asked. Ada nodded, making her ringlets bounce as a slight smile spread across her lips. Tell them I'm fine and that I'm seeing Yahweh at work in Egypt at last. They, and you, will see what I mean soon enough. Good night. And with a quick parting smile, Ada re-entered the palace and closed the door. I wonder what Ada meant by that, Jara pondered aloud as she made her way back out to the street. She repeated Ada's message over and over to herself, trying to remember every word to pass on to Ada's family and her own. Ada hardly ever got to go home, and she relied on Jara and her brothers to tell her own family what was going on in the palace. As Jara ran past a row of rich houses, she heard a lovely voice singing a song. Slowing, she saw a small girl her own age sitting in a tiny but exquisite courtyard. Vines grew over the small fence, and the girl sat very daintily on a wooden stool, her hands folded and resting in her lap. Tiny reed sandals peeped out from beneath the hem of her white linen dress, and she wore one golden bracelet on her thin wrist. She looked kindly into the face of a young boy about 5 years of age. The boy's head was shaved like every other Egyptian boy, except for a small patch of long black hair, and he wore a white skirt tied with a red cord. The boy was enraptured in his sister's song. Jara smiled. They looked so happy and peaceful. That was what she wanted, peace and freedom. Abruptly, Jara's foot hit a stone and she tumbled forwards, very awkwardly and landed hard on her hands and knees. She heard a voice call out, "Are you all right?" Jara looked up. The girl who had been singing was just reaching the gate. She looked concerned until she saw who Jara was. Her piercing black eyes instantly hardened and she said, "Oh, you're a Hebrew." She almost spat the word. "I thought you were someone else." The girl turned up her nose with an air of authority and disdain, which made Jara feel very uncomfortable. Blinking back tears of embarrassment, Jara slowly rose to her feet. Her right knee was stinging, but Jara masked the pain and said, rather clumsily, "I'm sorry, young lady." She bowed her head in reverence. The girl waved her hand dismissively. "You'd better go. It's almost curfew time. You could get turned in." The way the girl said "turned in" sent shivers up and down Jara's spine. "Yes, young lady," Jara said, trying to be polite. She bowed her head again, snatched her basket, and took off down the street into the darkness. But she heard a little voice with a lisp behind her. "Who was that, Asenath?" "A slave girl, Bess. A Hebrew. You don't need to concern yourself with her," she said in absolute disgust. Tears flowed freely from Jara's eyes now. She couldn't help but feel hurt. "She treated me like I didn't matter, like I was an animal." Jara brushed tears from her eyes and glanced down at her throbbing knee. She saw a trickle of blood spill down her calf. "You're so dumb and clumsy. You'll never amount to anything. You'll never be pretty and wealthy like her," Jara yelled inwardly. Her throat constricted as she tried to stop her bitter sobs. She couldn't think about it anymore. She just had to get home. Jara ran, barely seeing anything through the blur of tears. Her chest was heaving, but Jara didn't want to stop. She couldn't stop. She needed to get home. But just then, an arm shot out of the darkness and clutched her shoulder. Gasping in horror, Jara felt panic rush into her heart like a flood. She tried to pull away, but the hand tightened its grip on her arm. "Come on, Jara, you can get out of this," she told herself, struggling and kicking. But the vice-like grip tightened, and Jara knew there was no escape. She spun around to face her opponent, terror written all over her face as she stared up into angry black eyes.